but how do you fight bitterness against people who actively are working against you?
Thank you for the question. It's an important and question needs to be asked a lot, I believe, because bitterness is just rampant in the ministry because of people doing things that just hurt you as a pastor's wife. I have one answer for this question. The way you work through bitterness or deal with bitterness is you combat it with grief. You actually have to engage sadness and sorrow, I think, is what deals with grief, or deals with bitterness. So when we don't allow ourselves to feel sadness over the pain and the hurt that's been caused to us, that's where bitterness comes. So I actually think the answer is to grieve that pain, grieve that loss. We minister to people who lose loved ones, and we do funerals and all that stuff, and I hope we encourage people, you need to grieve this loss. Why do we say that to people? Well, it's the human soul's way of trying to find healing from the pain and the loss. But I think something that we miss is there's other losses in our lives that we need to grieve in the same way. Which means you have to be okay. There's a couple implications to this. You have to be okay with sadness. And a lot of us don't like to be sad. So that's the first thing. And I can personally relate to that. I've fought against being sad, hated being sad. And it was through the work of I met with a counselor for years when things imploded about 10 years ago for me. And this is where I learned this principle, that I believe that sadness is the healing emotion. And so sadness brings healing to the soul as we allow it to work in the midst of our losses. So I don't like to be sad, so I'll tell you what convinced me, because I remember even almost having an argument with my counselor because he was telling me I need to grieve, I need to be sad over these things that I was dealing with. I was bitter over, I was angry over. And I remember we almost had like a shouting match in this counseling session. And I said, tell me one good reason I should be sad. And he said to me, because Jesus is a man of sorrows, acquainted with grief. And I had no response. And that's what began the road to learn how to embrace sorrow and grief in my life towards loss. And I think that's the answer. I think Jesus meets us uniquely in our sorrow and our sadness. And I think that combats the bitterness. So if you battle with bitterness, I would encourage you to grieve the loss, grieve the pain. Take it to Jesus, lament. Micah talked about that book, Dark Clouds, Deep Mercy. Mark Vergope is a friend of mine, best book on Christian lament that exists that I'm aware of. So I would pick that up. But embrace sadness, embracing lament. I think that's how you work through the bitterness.
Amen.
That was a really good answer. I've seen my share of opposition, criticism. Just real briefly, the only thing I think I'd add on to that is the gospel really helps, because depending on what might be causing bitterness, like let's say somebody is just criticizing you a lot or working against you, like reminding myself that, I'm probably worse than what they're thinking about me because of the gospel, and yet also I'm more loved and cherished by Jesus because of the gospel. I don't need my identity to be shaken that much by what this person is saying or thinking about me. That's really hard for me, but that has just been a really encouraging thought for me. And then also, no matter what they're saying, there's probably some truth behind it, even if it's malicious. And so trying to be like, okay, you're saying this and you don't like me, but there's probably something I can learn here behind what you're saying. Sees the redemptive quality of it. But, yeah.
Good. Thank you, guys. Thanks for the question. This one shifts gears to the elders talk. Amongst a plurality of elders, should there ideally be a head or lead pastor, Or should there ideally be a complete equality?
I mean, I would just say, I hold this pretty loosely. At Redemption Hill, we try not to have a lead pastor kind of a role. That's just where our convictions landed. And so even though I'm the elder for preaching and vision, I'm the only one on staff. Some people might think of me that way. I've been influenced a lot by Tony Marita and some others that have done more work than me on this. But my convictions just kind of land where, like, there's only one senior pastor, and I don't want to take his job. That's Jesus. And so is there a role for a first among equals? I think it's permissible because church history, like orthodoxy, I think shows us that. I just don't see that anywhere in the Bible. And so if somebody was to ask me, like, is there a first among equals at Redemption Hill? I would say, sure, but it depends on what we're talking about, right? I might be the first among equals when it comes to figuring out the preaching calendar and preaching 70% of the time. Jeff, it kind of is over corporate worship, and so we actually try to defer to him in those areas. And then Mason is kind of like over small groups and stuff like that. And so we're mutually submitting to one another and deferring to one another. That's how we try to practice it, more of a parody. But I hold that very loosely, but that's where we land.
Yeah, well, I recently read Plurality Principle, which I think was in all of your bags. Is that true? So I would encourage you to read that because it does address both of those issues, complete equality, and then lays out the benefits of having a lead pastor role. So the way we do it at New City is we do see ourselves as equal. There's 5 elders at New City. We see ourselves as equal, but our roles are definitely distinct. And my role, so we would say that I'm the lead pastor, and all that would signify is that I do the brunt of the preaching. And like what you said, Micah, the vision of the church is generally something that's coming from me overall, but we meet together all the time. And so there is an intentionality of even taking what I believe the Lord has led me in and checking that with these other brothers that I deeply rely upon spiritually to say, is this the direction God wants to take the church? So even though I may come with more of the vision casting and the direction and ultimately the direction of our preaching, it's not without sharing. And so I think if you do have a lead pastor role, I think you just have to be really intentional to create a culture of equality as well. So,
yeah, that's a good answer. So I would just take it a step further and say that I think what's healthy is that elders are equal in authority and the ability to make decisions, and you can try to do your best to approach it that way. But here's what I've found is that what organically happens is that there's a separation that takes place. So typically, whether you call him lead pastor or you call him co-pastor, that's really semantics in a lot of ways for me, because the person who's preaching the most and the person who is the main vision caster is naturally going to have more influence in the church than everybody else. Just the way it works, that I found it works. So what you call everybody in the different roles you play, I think you do all you can to create the equality. And that's got, the equality is important because it creates the accountability among all the elders, regardless on their role. But you've got one full-time lead pastor who preaches 70% of the time and is the main vision caster. Well, he's with the people the most, he's preaching the most, he's ministering the word the most. I mean, that person's going to naturally have the most impact. I think that's okay. That's the first among equals you're referring to, and I think whether you like it or not, that merges somewhere. Yeah. And I don't think that's something to try to fight against, because I do think somebody's got to emerge to lead the leaders. Yeah. But on the backside of that, I think you've got to balance it out with, decision making. That guy needs to be able to be overruled without question by the rest of the elders. Yeah. And I would say this as somebody who is the senior pastor, the only pastor, and I moved us to elders. When we moved to elders about 6 years in, I had to make a really proactive effort for the next, I'd say 3 or 4 years, to these new elders we put forward, for me to push them forward and me step back and let the congregation see them as the same as me to the best of my ability. Now, that's not going to totally happen, but it happened largely, and it took a few years. So
I think almost whoever that first among the equals is has to know he's that.
Yeah.
And so it's his job to celebrate and to champion the other elders to say, these guys are just as important as I am.
Sure.
And make sure you look to them in that way. And so that give and take, I think, has to happen.
I think that there's a practical aspect to that if we are going to be church planting churches, because the likelihood of you sending out an elder team is very small. You're going to send out a visionary that has a desire to plant a church in a community that needs it. So that person is going to be the lead pastor. He's going to be looked to. And then eventually, as you develop elders, I feel like you could go too far to then all of a sudden say, I'm not the guy anymore. Now it's all of us. Whereas what God has naturally done is called you to a vision and a work that these elders can come around you in, and I think you can create equality in different ways.
Yeah, I've been a part of several church plants. I've served on an advisory board with several church plants through the years that just asked me to kind of be involved. And several of them planted with two pastors, and they did the co-pastor model. And that's a pretty popular thing to happen in a church plant. And I was on board, but they knew where I was on this. I pretty much said, look, I love the spirit of what you're doing. You feel free to call yourself co-pastors. Just prepare that within 5 years, one of you is going to emerge from the other one.
Yeah.
Just know that. It's okay. That's naturally happens. In every case, that happened inside of 5 years.
Interesting.
So I think you just have to realize that more than likely is usually what's going to happen. But the spirit of a co-pastoring model, I mean, I celebrate it. I think it's great.
Yeah, and I'll just add on just real briefly to that functionally, like what we experience at Redemption Hill is very similar to that. We just intentionally try to use terminology and roles to battle the idea that there is one guy that is more important, and that when people have questions, they need to know they can go to Jeff and they can go to Mason, and they are elders just like me, and we make decisions together. And so in a sense, it's more of like a convictional way of saying, like, yeah, I have more office hours, and so I'm probably meeting with more people, I'm preaching more often. I might have a little bit more of that influence and responsibility, but still as co-equals and trying everything we can to make sure the congregation knows we are being led by a team that are equal under the Lord, even if there are different responsibilities and levels of influence. So that's where our heart is behind that.
We'll stay on the elder theme. But this is advice on removing an elder that doesn't have blatant sin, but is not qualified. I think we'll defer to you, Brian.
Me too. I have no experience with that, so.
The first thing I would say is that a lot of guys who don't have elders and really want them come to me and talk about how much of a challenge it is to try to implement elders in a church that's already existed for a long time. And that is hard. I would say that arguably one of the things that's harder is what you just said. I think it's better to have no elders and eventually be able to move to put the right elders in place one day than it is to try to remove an elder who already exists, unless there's a really obvious reason that elder needs to be removed. So I think actually guys who have a harder time, the ones that inherit a group of elders and all of them don't qualify as elders, and then trying to figure out what to do with that. So if that's you, that's, I think, arguably the most challenging situation that you face. So I think, but the way you deal with an elder who maybe isn't blatant sin but doesn't qualify, should not be an elder. I think there's two approaches that have to be happening at the same time. You need to be raising up other elders that fit, that reach the bar, that fit the mold of what you're wanting to elders to be in your church. And then I think you have every right to challenge your current elders to be those elders. And let those elders see if they step up or if they get really irritated with you. And that's going to happen over the course of years. But what I find is when you do all that together, you have new elders come in and they buy in totally what that bar is. You got other elders being challenged and they're actually trying to step in. So here's a classic example. There'll be a group of elders and none of them shepherd at all in the church. They're like a decision-making body, but they're not in people's lives. They're not shepherding, caring for people's souls. We talked about 1 Peter 5. That's exactly what an elder's supposed to do. So if they're not doing that, they're not at all stepping into that role. I think any pastor, regardless on the situation he's walked into, can read 1 Peter 5 to them and go, so who's shepherding And this is what an elder, what do you guys do? And that is a clear starting point. I mean, it's just undeniable that that text says what they're supposed to be doing. So I think that text, because it's so clear, gives you an opportunity to press your current elders. And the elder who doesn't qualify for whatever reason, I think that's the starting place to where you see new elders come in, you see other people trying to step up, and then the guy who's just not doing anything and just pushing against you, and that happens for years and years. A lot of times these guys weed themselves out. But it takes years a lot of times, and that's a frustrating work to do. But I think the ideal is for that elder to see he doesn't fit into what you are saying elders do, and he needs to remove himself. That's the easiest option, and a lot of times it takes years, not months.
That's good. Thanks, Brian. All right, so this is a quote from something that you had said, and then the question, elders have oversight over everything in the church. In daily actions involving things other than preaching and teaching and oversight, what role should elders have in daily functions? Examples, finances, buildings, grounds, etc. And when should elders step in? When should they be hands off?
Well, that's a loaded question.
It's a lot.
So I would say that the terminology is oversight that Peter gives, and overseer is what Paul says to Timothy. I mean, obviously one of the ways that word's translated. So, but when we have oversight over something, we're not in the weeds of all those things. We just can't be.
Yeah.
So I think that's the verse I want to highlight. It's the nature of oversight is you're the umbrella. Oh, everything falls under that umbrella. But the idea is that you have oversight over the people who are doing a lot of that work. But I think this is where just running organizations even can be helpful in applying oversight ideas. You step in the times where there's somebody who needs to step in and deal with different things. I think that elders who micromanage ministries and leaders frustrate the leaders and make them not want to do that work anymore. So I think those who have oversight have to learn how to be really good delegators and people who know how to champion other people's efforts really well. Here's another thing I'll say on this. The reason to step in one reason to not step in as somebody who has oversight over something is if you see you could do it better than the person who's doing it. That's actually not a good reason to do it. Or that you care more than that person doing it, yeah, that's also not a good reason. So the pastor who micromanages, those are the two top reasons he gives on micromanaging everybody. I can do it better, and I know, and I'm going to do it the way I want to do it. And you're going to just micromanage everybody. You're going to frustrate everyone. So oversight, I believe, is about delegating to competent people. Let them do it their way as much as you can. And be the chief encourager of all those people who are doing the work. And then when something implodes or somebody who needs some serious help about something, I think that's when we step in with pockets. And by the way, one of the many reasons to have elders, because whoever steps in that needs to be an elder who actually would be the best person to step into that role. So if it's finances, the elder that's got the most, who's most financially savvy would probably be the best elder to step in and do that.
Yeah.
So the elders knowing their different individual gifts is also helpful for the team to then know, all right, which guy needs to be able to handle this. So there's a few thoughts on it.
It's awesome. All right. Did you want to add something to that?
I can just add that.
Yeah.
I think this is a great example of, what are your values? Right? If the value is we want the best externally looking, polished whatever, then the temptation in my heart is going to be to micromanage and to make sure it happens perfectly. But if the value is I want to love and lead people and give and equip them for ministry and really believe that God has brought an entire body with different parts to bless each other and to bless the church, then having them do it and maybe fumbling their way forward is better, if that is the value. And also, I'll just plug a book. When it comes to finance, one of the best books I've ever read is actually a book on church budgets called Budgeting for a Healthy Church. I believe Jamie Dunlop wrote that. It's a 9 Marks book. Amazing book about the elder's role in casting vision for the budget and understanding that with biblical kingdom values. So just encourage that. If you're like, what should the elders or the pastor be involved when it comes to the budget? that book is just like pure gold. So it's called Budgeting for a Healthy Church. And I believe Jamie Dunlop is the one who wrote that. It's fantastic.
Awesome. All right, maybe two. We'll see if we can do two more. How long should training for elders be, and deacons as well? Yeah, I'll start. I mean, we so at New City we have successfully raised up 4 elders beyond me. The first was our executive pastor, and it was 6 months because he was qualified and we needed more elders. And so, but then the remaining 3 were all 1-year periods. And the way we do it, if this interests you as well, is we always present the person to the church beforehand as they're coming into a 1-year eldership candidacy, and we call them candidates. And then we let them know to be praying for them and their family, knowing that the elders that exist are going to be walking with them for a year through some intentional training. We use Bob Thune's book, Gospel Eldership. If you guys have not read that or looked at that, it's a tool that we use. And then, nearing the end of the year, in their candidacy, we also let the church know that if during this time of candidacy they've seen disqualifying character, or for any reason why they should not be an elder in the church, we give them kind of the final month to come to the elders with anything that would break biblical qualifications. But barring that, we aim for about a year. But we're not rigid with it. It's just a number we've chosen that we think is adequate time to walk through enough things so that the church knows and so that the elders know. But that's about a year for us. And deacons, we're figuring that out. We're one of those churches, I kind of had to look down like this when you said, you've got the elders but no deacons. We have deacon candidates, praise God, but we are trying to figure that out, But we would say probably 6 months to a year, but we also really need deacons, so it could be quicker. So, yeah, that's where we're at.
Yeah, we're still figuring out a lot as a church. We just started an elder training cohort that has 3 guys in it right now, and that is different than candidating or assessing. I was especially feeling like this urge that, like, especially in a New England context, like, you pray and you wait, but also that responsibility of training and inspiring, like those who aspire to the role of an elder. Like, can we present a vision? And then in terms of like how long should that take, we're still figuring that out. It might take a while, especially because of capacity. The needs are definitely there, and so like I'm still figuring that out. But we did figure out a plan, and we're moving forward with that. And then the hope is that if any of these guys start feeling that aspiration, and we want to affirm that in them, then we'd go through an assessment where then we're assessing their character, their ability to teach the word to a certain level of faithfulness, and then how do we bring you in safely? I really like that idea of giving time for the congregation to know, here's who, pray about it, get to know them, let us know if there's anything that should be concerning to us. I think that's really important.
Yeah,
I agree with everything you guys just said. I'll just put this twist on it. Somebody asked me, when does your future elders and deacons, when do they enter the process of evaluation? My answer is at their membership interview. So when I sit down and talk with them, in the same way, a single person who's engaged to be married, when I do a membership interview and they potentially become a member of our church and I'll be one of their pastors, that I'm making note in that moment, part of pastoring them is helping them with their preparing for marriage and whatever comes with that and shepherding them through that. At a membership interview, when somebody sits down and says, I don't know what to do with this, but I feel some kind of call in the ministry, but I'm not sure what that means or whatever. Middle note was made at their membership interview that they're feeling potentially an internal call into the ministry. And part of me being their pastor is in shepherding them is actually helping to think through and develop that with them. We approached it a little differently in that we did the same thing that these guys mentioned, but we actually waited later to make it public. So we would have people technically in the elder candidacy process among the elders for 6-12 months. Only the elders knew. And we would do that, and we would put them in ministry context, like, they'd be leading services, they'd be preaching occasionally, they would be leading in different ways. We would just do that as part of their gifting. And the church would be able to see them, but they wouldn't know that they were officially in that process. And only when the elders were unanimously ready to put someone forward to the church to say, we think this person's an elder, then we'd go public with them, and there'd be a 3-month process of the congregation to be able to ask them questions. We do Q&A, come to us if they have concerns. We had a couple of moments where we did what you guys were described, and we had a couple of people who realized that they could not be elders based on qualification or something.
Yeah.
And that ended up being a really painful thing that we went through. And so we asked, is there a way to do this and avoid that if possible? And so we decided as elders to just take people through a more stringent process before we went public with it. And we ended up being able to not deal with that as much. But to answer the question, there's no timetable. It's a matter of walking through a process, and that the congregation has enough time to be able to talk to the elders about it before they actually become an elder.
I'll add that we had experience with that where we had 2 elder candidates that after 4 months into the year, they also each realized that they weren't. It wasn't necessarily that there was any kind of blatant sin, but after looking at the what was going to be required and their season of life, they said they weren't ready for it. But we used that as an opportunity to elevate the purpose of the candidacy. So they each came before the church and announced what they were removing themselves for. It's maybe more vague than they needed. They were vague, which was good. But it allowed the church to see why we candidate. And so there was a healthy process.
Which is another argument to why there's not one way to do it.
Exactly.
God's going to work in the process, just like he did there.
Yep. All right, so that covers most of the questions. If your question didn't get answered, I'm so sorry. But you can talk to Brian afterwards, and I'd encourage you guys to take those to him or to any one of us. But we're going to wrap it up with just 2 more songs. You guys should know them all. Let's sing them with all of our heart, and then I'll come back up and we'll close, and you guys can go home.